All right, thanks everyone for coming out. Sorry we're a few minutes late getting started. Had some technical difficulties for the streaming. Is Michael Trotter here? No? Okay, he's our second speaker. I hope he shows up. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Tonight's kind of a special occasion because it's our 1 year anniversary. Our first meetup was last October. So this has been 1 year. It's been a fun process. Thank you guys all for your support, for coming out. We wouldn't be here without you. Thank you. Also want to just thank our sponsors, ATTAS for providing food and a place for us to meet, O'Reilly and Egghead for providing some perks to our members, and Front End Masters also. So there's food in the back if you've not already gotten some. There's also some stickers. I hope you saw those. Those were for you. Please take some. We got 2 talks, hopefully, if Michael shows up. I'm going to give the first talk on HTTP with Angular, and then Michael's going to give a talk on RxJS. And then after that, if anyone has some lightning talks they want to give, about 5-minute talks on just something you've been working on or something you find interesting with Angular that you've discovered recently, whatever it might be. We'll do some lightning talks after that, and then we'll do some raffles and some extra stuff after that. So without further ado, turn the time over to myself. Okay.
Matt, can we lower these front lights?
Yeah. Can someone grab them over here on the panel back there? Cool. So my talk tonight is on Angular's HTTP service. Michael sent me a proposal to do a talk on RxJS, and he said in the description that it came with a caveat that he assumed people had some familiarity with HTTP. I thought I'll make sure everyone has familiarity by giving a talk before his. So let's jump into it. So, too far. I thought it'd be fun to kind of go through the history of XHR, kind of where it came from and where we're at now. So in the beginning was full page reload, and the full page reload was total crap. Look at some code examples. Get the cursor out of the way. So a full page reload, pretty common. I mean, it's kind of like the way you did stuff back in maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah.
Can we make that a little bigger? Is that possible?
Yeah.
I guess we don't need to see total crap. But.
Yeah. Is that good? Hopefully that doesn't cut into some of the other slides. So you used to have a full page reload. So essentially what you have is you load your full boilerplate for your website. You're going to load all your scripts, all your style sheets, etc. And then you're going to have something like a form. And in the form, you're just going to do an action to the server, and it's going to just do a full page reload. And basically everything that was loaded is totally gone. And the next page load comes back from the server. Hey, great. Your form has been submitted successfully. Or worst case, there was an error. There's some validation or something. And then you did a full page reload for no reason at all, just to tell the user your input wasn't good. Wrong way. So here's some of the downsides of it and the pros, I guess. It's really easy to implement, right? You don't even need JavaScript to do this. Just hook it up and it just works. I don't think I like this thing. I'm just going to use my keyboard. So it's easy to implement. Oftentimes you get a blank screen while the screen is loading because there's no feedback for the user. Or worse, it just hangs and it looks like it's still on the same page and you try clicking around, but it doesn't really work. And you get really poor performance with this because, like I said, you got to download the entire boilerplate of your site. All the scripts and styles have to be processed again and re-downloaded. Hopefully they'll be cached, but it's still bad. So then the next kind of iteration of this is what I call fake jacks. It wasn't called fake jacks then because no one knew what Ajax was. But basically it's a way of pretending like Ajax is happening. You want something to happen behind the scenes without doing the full page reload. So again, you got a form with an action, but now you can set a target on the form, which says, I want this to be invoked on something matching that ID. So in this case, it's an iframe. And on submit, we just return false, so it doesn't go back to the server. And then on load, I need to know that the frame has loaded, and then we can process the response, whatever that might be. A lot of times it's probably XML back then. So you got no indication of progress on this, at least with a full page reload. Like the browser gives you like some kind of indicator in the status bar that stuff's being downloaded. Parsing the iframe DOM was really ugly. I tried to come up with some example code, but I wrote that so long ago I can't remember what we did. You got to like get down into the window of the iframe. It was pretty hairy. And then XML is just really verbose. JSON wasn't really like a de facto back then. So then comes along XHR. So it came from Microsoft around 99, 2000 for their Exchange server. And then they shipped it in the browsers with IE5, which I was actually surprised that it happened that early. In IE5, you could do XHR with the ActiveX directive. And then that got fully baked into Mozilla in 2002. And then it became a web standard in 2004, 2005. And then finally, I don't know, I guess like the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It originates with Microsoft. They finally get like a full-blown XHR object in IE7. So here's just some example code. You get this up at the top, some kind of a factory just saying, hey, there's all the different ways I can create an XHR object. Then some method that'll kind of go through each of those and find the first one that passes successfully. And then from there, we can open the request, set headers if we want, and then listen for the ready state change to know that the data came back. And then you got to check the status just to say, am I successful or not? So with this, you still don't really get a progress indicator. You got to hook up something yourself just to say, hey, the page is loading. Messing around with ActiveX is kind of a pain. And no one really uses XML anymore. So we've married ourselves to XML HTTP requests, and everything's kind of shifted away. I mean, people probably still use XML, but that's kind of stupid. So the newest thing that's kind of trending is this window fetch. So this is going to be built on top of the window potentially. It's kind of still being developed by Google for Chrome. So you'd have a fetch, and you can just give it the URL that you're trying to load, and then it uses promises. So just supporting ES6 promises then would be a success. Catch would be an error, and you could chain it. Like I say, this would replace XHR potentially. It's being developed by Chrome. I don't know of any other vendor that's working on that right now, and it's really only available as a polyfill. At the end of my slides, I have a link to where you can find that if you're interested. So that jumps us to Angular's HTTP. So under the hood, it's got Q for promises. This is basically like Chris Kowal's Q library, but some tweaks for Angular so you can hook into digest and apply on the scope. It uses HTTP backend and Cache Factory if you want. So just a sample usage of how HTTP works. You can create just a simple module and then just dependency inject the HTTP object. It takes a config, which we'll look at a little bit more in detail. And the bare minimum you need is just a URL. This is what I'm trying to load. And then using ES6 style promises, you can catch or handle the response accordingly. So it's actually pretty similar to the window fetch that we just looked at. Under the hood for the config, there's actually a lot of options. So like I said, the URL is the bare minimum that you need, but you can also give it a method. By default, it's just get, but it'll also support head and delete, post, put, and patch. And they even have something, if you give it JSONP, it'll kind of go through a different code path and handle JSONP for you. The params is just query string parameters that you want to pass to your server. You can give it a string, or you can give it an object, and it will do it to JSON on it. Same thing for data, and that will end up as the post body. So that won't work on a get, but you could do it for a post, put, or patch. You can give it whatever headers you want. Just give it an object, and it'll just do key value on them. It has some built-in security stuff for cross-site request forgery. Be aware, like, you still have to hook this up on the server. Just because they provide this on the front end, you still have to do something on the back end to protect yourself. And then we'll look into this a little bit more. But you can do a transform on either the request or the response. We can cache requests. By default, that's false. It doesn't do caching. You can set a timeout. by default, there's nothing provided. There is no timeout. You can either give it a number, which is milliseconds, or you can give it a promise to resolve. And then these are just things that get passed straight into the XHR with credentials and response type. It's part of the XHR spec. So let's take a look at the response. There's actually two ways, and I just realized that I never included the second way to do this in my slides. I really prefer the promise style with then. It takes a response object, and it came with 4 different parameters on there. So the data is what came back from the server, whatever that was. The headers is the headers that came back in the response. The status is the status of the response. And then finally, the config is what was used to create that request, kind of coming back to up here. Whatever you passed it, that's what it gives you back. An optional way to do this, instead of a then, you can also do a success, and it will spread these out. It'll give you all 4 of these, but it'll give you them as 4 different arguments. So you'd have data, headers, status, and config as 4 separate parameters. You can do it either way. I prefer the then. So then there's some shortcuts. The way I showed before is you'd actually invoke HTTP directly as a function, but they provide aliases for all of the supported request methods. So you could do a get, just http.get, pass in the URL, and then handle it with whatever callback you want to use. And then likewise with post. Post takes an extra parameter, which is the data, and that's just what's the post body that you want to send to the server with your request. And then the config, like I said, is completely optional. Sometimes it's kind of a pain to have to pass in all the config on each request if it's going to be the same thing throughout your application. So you can use the HTTP provider in your config on your module to say, these are some of the defaults that I'm going to use, and this is going to go with every single request. So whether that be changing the token for the XSRF header name or adding your own custom headers, you can also do basically any of the config options you can set on the common or on the defaults. So let's take a look at the transformers. You can transform both a request or a response. And this is a way that you can change the data that's either being sent or received from the server. Angular has some built-in ones that we'll look at. You can transform the headers on the request also. So I gave that previous example of changing like the token on the XSRF for the header. You could do it just for this one request, or you could use the defaults for each request. So the built-in transformers are there to transform JSON. That's like what Angular's kind of determined is the most common use case. Most people sending data to the server, it's coming in as JSON and needs to get serialized. So the request going to the server, it kind of does a sanity check and says, hey, does this look like JSON? Cool, serialize it. And then the same thing with the response coming back from the server. And then there's also some stuff in there to kind of protect against some JSON vulnerabilities. So you can provide your own transformers. Again, in the config on the HTTP provider, this transformer I wrote to serialize or to take a ISO 8601 formatted date and say, I don't want that string, I want an actual date object. So anytime I get a response from the server, I just say, any response, it gives you the data and the headers, go through every key in the object. If it matches this regex, then actually make it into a date object. So just a simple example of how you could use that. There are some gotchas with using the transformers, and this is one that I've seen actually in my own coded at task. I didn't write it. So kind of looks just like what we looked at before. We got a transform request. It's a function, and let's say just for whatever reason we want everybody that submits a form, always make sure their name's Joe. It's kind of a stupid example, but so we got some kind of a transformer happening up here. But then down here, we already looked at the built-in Angular transformers. Why are we doing an Angular to JSON on the data that's being sent in? Does anyone have an idea? Yeah. Exactly. So you can't just assign it. You can if that's what you want. If you really don't want to use Angular's built-in transformers, you can just reassign it. But then you just blew away the one that Angular uses. So it's actually an array. And here's the workaround that Angular suggests on their website. Is anytime you're adding adding transformers, is to use something like this. Because of the way I just did it in this previous example, it's no longer an array, and I put this on the defaults. So if someone else later tries to append to that, it's going to blow up because the defaults aren't an array. So this kind of makes sure that it is always an array, but then it also prevents us from accidentally getting rid of the transformers if that's not the behavior we want. Again, you might, but this way you can just append the transformer using this as the default, and then it'll just do a concat on there. So just a gotcha to be aware of. So the next thing is interceptors. Interceptors are very similar to transformers. With the transformer, we're transforming the data that's being sent to and from the server. With interceptors, we're intercepting the actual request before it's dispatched, or when it's the response, it's before it gets sent back to the user. And then you can also handle requests and response errors. And this allows us to modify the configuration of the request as it's going out or coming back, where with transformers, we're not transforming the request, but we're not transforming the data, we're transforming the actual configuration that we pass in, which is like what method to use, things like that. So I have a couple examples of interceptors here. So here's a really simple one. I just want to log out anytime a request is sent to the server. So again, we're using HTTP provider, and on there we say the interceptors, and that's an array, push onto there the logging interceptor, which is going to look on my module and find something matching. So I've got a factory here that takes the log, and then I just return an object that has a request method. On there, I get the config that's been used for the request, and I can log out what method and URL is being used for that request. It's kind of a contrived example, but just an example of how it would work. So here's maybe a more useful one. If you want to do some benchmarking on your site and see what's the latency and how long are my requests taking. So on here, we got basically the same thing up here with our interceptor being defined. And then I'm going to handle both on a request and on a response in this case. So when the request is being made, let's just set date.now onto the config's request time property. We're creating that. It doesn't already exist. And then likewise on the response, just create a response time to date.now. And then whenever I make a request, if I wanted to, I could just say, hey, how long did that request take going to and from the server? This is an example that I found online. Again, I'll link to it later in my slides, of how you could maybe use interceptors to recover from a session being expired. So a typical case of this would be you leave your browser open overnight at work, you go home, come back the next day, the session's timed out, but you want to do some kind of work. So you click the button to delete something or whatever, and without something like this, you're probably going to just be borked, like it's going to send you back to a login screen or something. So the session might have been timed out, but maybe on the client, the cookie's still alive. So on this, we've got a session recover interceptor that we add, and then we're using the response error. So the four keys that are on an interceptor, we already looked at request and response. Then there's response error and request error. So in this case, we check if the status coming back from the server is that the session is expired. In that case, we'll get this session service, which is handling the sessions, and the HTTP, and then create a deferred. And then we can create a new request from inside of our interceptor. And that's the thing that's really cool on the interceptors is you can, as we did in the previous examples, just modify the config and just directly return it. In this case, we can also return a promise, and Angular will wait for that promise to resolve before it continues on with whatever work has to be done. So we do a login and say handle it with these two, resolve and reject. And then we return this so that when it does come back, we can just do whatever they were trying to do originally. And then we return the promise that we just created. And we do the reject so that we keep with the, currently we're in an error. Angular supports caching with the HTTP. So here's how it works. You can cache the response data, but it only will work with a GET. You don't want to cache like a post, for example. And then you can also do custom caching. So by default, the simplest way you can do caching is in your config, when you make your request, just set cache to true. And internally, that will use Angular's cache factory. And the next time you make a GET on that same URL, it'll say, hey, I've already got this response before. I'll just resolve that immediately. You can create your own custom cache by doing something like this. So I've got a factory called custom cache, and I'm going to take the cache factory and basically just return a new cache factory, and I'm going to call it custom. Then inside of my controller, I can do something like this. Have a method called load data. When I do this GET on this URL, I'm going to tell it to use my custom cache for the cache factory instead. And then when it comes back, just reassign data. Then I can clear the cache later potentially and just remove using that same URL so it knows which one to go off of. And then I can just manage my own cache however I want to. This is something I kind of like to do if you're going to make multiple requests at the same time, is use queue.all so that I can send out, I know that I need to get the user and I need to get their permissions from the server. We're going to make those requests in tandem at the same time. So I can use queue.all, which will say, give me an array of promises. And once all of those promises has resolved, then call my callback. So it'll go out, get the user, it'll get the permissions for that user, and then give me a response, which is an array, and that will match the order that these two are. So 0 would be the user, 1 would be the permissions. I can stick those on my scope. So anyway, that's kind of a handy shortcut if you need to make multiple requests at the same time. And you don't want to do anything before they both come back. So here's some resources for using HTTP. Some documentation on just Angular's queue, HTTP, and the cache factory. Some of the examples that I showed in my code was from this web dev easy. And there's a lot more stuff on there. That's actually a really useful resource. I recommend that one a lot. The polyfill for the window.fetch is on GitHub Fetch. And then I created a library called Axios that basically follows the same API for the most part. I still don't have interceptors or caching. But this is to use basically an HTTP-like functionality outside of Angular. So I was using some React, and I'm like, hey, I need something like this. I wish I could use HTTP. So I just recreated HTTP, I guess. Anyway, those are some good resources to check out. And that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So will Angular's default cache factory respect cache headers from the server at all?
That's an excellent question. So the question is, will Angular's cache factory respect the cache headers from the server? I don't know how it actually looks at the headers on the cache factory. I honestly don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. I will look it up and find out and let you know. Yeah?
With that cache restore, are you talking about, like they turn off their computer or whatnot, they want to come back and do the same, continue with that session and you re-prompt them to log in? Or
So that's on this one.
yeah.
So the idea behind this would be basically their session has expired, but instead of them like being redirected, it's often case like I've started doing something at work, it's quitting time, I need to go home, and I haven't really wrapped it all up. I'm just gonna leave my computer. When I come back, if my session's expired, I might have stuff in progress that I'm working on. I don't want it to like go back to the server and redirect me to a login screen, and now I've lost everything that I've been working on, right? So this would basically be kind of like a fail-safe that says, hey, if they're logged out, try and log in transparently. I mean, maybe this still doesn't work. Like maybe the login, you have to provide credentials. Maybe you don't work off of a cookie or something. But in the case that you're using like some kind of a session cookie, potentially this could save your butt on that case. Yeah. Go back.
If you set cache to true and you use the same URL for two subsequent calls, but you pass different parameters, will it use the cache?
I think if you give it different query string parameters, I think it will do a new request because it's technically not the same. I think it has to match all of that.
I think on get the pass parameters, not in the URL itself.
Right, and if someone knows differently, let me know. But I think it will build out the full URL first. I believe so. Yeah.
So can you set a timeout on the cache itself? Or is there some kind of set for when it expires?
It would probably just be whatever Cache Factory does, and I don't know that off the top of my head. Okay, you have to build your own to time it out. So it'll just hold on to it basically for the session. Okay. Do you know some off the top of your head? Oh, there's the Angular cache. Yeah. So you could do something like that. Yeah, that makes sense. Nick?
Any thoughts on when you'd use resource versus HTTP?
Yeah, so HTTP is kind of a lower level, and resource is built on top of that. Resource is more like if you're dealing with like an object model, and it's like this is how to get a user, edit a user, that kind of stuff, where HTTP is more just like raw, I need to get JSON data or make a request to the server other than like working with an object model. And again, Jason Dobry did Angular cache. He also has Angular data. I put that as a superset like way above resource. Yeah?
Do you have an opinion about using something like Angular data or Rust Angular or something versus kind of going closer to the metal?
I do have an opinion. I just started implementing Angular data at work, and I've really, really liked it. We've used resource for a long time, and I don't know if we just implemented it really poorly or what, but it just kind of got messy. With Angular data, you can bring in something like Angular cache for handling caching. So anytime I get this user, it kind of just knows you already have it, and then you can set like an expiration on when you had that last, should it go out and get it again. And it's really easy to just define a resource for every object type with Angular, Angular's resource. And like I said, I don't know if this is just like how we implemented it, but it kind of felt like you just defined one resource for all of our data. So getting like a user or a task or whatever it might have been is all kind of just wrapped up into one resource. And I think, like I said, I think there's probably a better way to implement that. I really have liked Angular data thus far, but I'm only like a week or two into playing with it. So I don't have a strong opinion, but that's my opinion for what it's worth. Yeah?
Will the cache survive through a page refresh?
No, the cache will not survive through page refresh. It's basically an in-memory cache. So once you reload, it's gone. Using the Cache Factory, you could probably build your own that would like save to local storage or something if you wanted to. And that would go back to how you just define your own Cache Factory instance. Yeah.
On the timeout, I thought I heard you say you can either do milliseconds or a promise.
Correct.
How does that work?
So with, see if I can find where it was. Somewhere, there we go. So in the config, you can say timeout. So by default, it's just nothing. There is no timeout. You can do the milliseconds, or you can set a promise that will resolve. Might be best to look at Angular's. I've not used it myself. I just came across it when I was putting the talk together. And now it's not connecting. I don't know. I'll look up that because that's really interesting. I've never tried it that way. I saw it in the spec when I was kind of putting the talk together that it supported that, but I didn't take any time to play around with it. Yeah.
I was just going to say on that map, I actually used that on a project with server-side validators. It was nice because it's a way you just resolve the promise. If you say have another request come in or something else, you can resolve it and it'll just cancel that one and you can invoke another one. So that's how it works. You just invoke the promise.
Oh, interesting. So
Resolve it.
you could use the promise to say something else from the server has null and void the request that was currently in flight.
Yeah.
So kill it off.
Like, just kill it off.
That makes a lot of sense.
Set up another one. So it's just a nice way to cancel that and start up a new one.
Yeah, that's really cool. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Cool. There's no other questions. Is Michael here? Michael is here. Thank you. Turn the time over to Michael.
All right. Where's this one? Hmm. Just gonna try switching them. Okay, I can do it off the memory one. Still really tiny. Still really tiny. picture, you've got this stream of things, and each one creates a promise, which is then another stream. And you could store and keep all that data, but in this case, we only care about the latest one. So we're taking that stream of streams, it's like multi-dimensional streams, and we're outputting it into only the latest one. So whoever subscribes to this one is only going to get the most recent one that was asked for, which is kind of a key difference. It's not the most recent one that came back from the server, it's the most recent one based on the stream that fed into this originally. Which is kind of nice to know that you're always getting the most recent value. Alright, anything else? Sure. So I have those little log statements there, and you can see when you hit this. Here, let me clear this. So we hit F, and our first stream says, hey, an F passed through here, and then the resulting stream that was after the flat map from the server has printed out the data came back. But we didn't actually have anything from descending, nothing passed through there, it's just sitting at its initial value, which is whatever happened to be on the scope when it was wired up. So what we could do and then flip it here, so now descending has changed, and so now there's one value in each stream, and it's triggered 2 requests from the server. So in this one, that's pretty much it, besides having the clear side effects. So like there's an example, oh, I can get it because I have internet now. So this is a system that we use where I work, building across the street. But basically this whole grid is powered by this reactive stuff. So these first couple buttons are, there's an object that represents that state, there's an object for this state, there's a stream for the refresh button, and there's a stream for reset. And so the stuff that's refreshing the UI and like graying stuff out is only in one place, and all it cares about is that a new request was started to the server. And it joins that then to the response stream. So there's just one thing sitting there that says, when a request comes in, clear everything out. When a response comes in, put it back. And that's all that it has to worry about. And it's sitting there in that code, like explicitly as a side effect for at this point in the chain of events, touch this. And so it's, you can kind of, it just feels a lot cleaner, I guess. Right, so you can do, basically all of these are, everything on the top is Angular, and then all the results are rendered using Angular, but all of the business logic connecting those two pieces is done through streams in a way where you can glance at it and see what's affecting what, who cares about what. It's also nice because you can explicitly do side effects like if I hit theirs and then refresh, it's still there because there's a side effect that's setting that in my local storage.
issue here, so and I'm running out of my lightning time on this, so I'll just make it brief. Joe Eames, those of you who know him, I think he's the organizer of the one up north. Is that correct, Matt? Yeah, so he told me, we were in discussion, he told me to jump down here. I'll make it really short. We started a crowdsourcing genealogy web app. We've got an Angular front end. We're just finishing up moving our back end stack over to Express, NoSQL, and Node, and so we are hiring. I was gonna just show the app, just because I know this is more of a technical thing, and I'm used to mostly going to the startup meetups. But if any of you are interested, we are hiring. We just opened up our seed round. There's 4 of us right now, three developers, 2 of which are full stack, and myself. So it's called Ancestor Cloud. You can check out the web app at beta.ancestorcloud.com. Just 2 words, Ancestor Cloud. But anyway, yeah, we're hiring. We're moving pretty quick. We have our first, right now we have our first 1,000 private beta users. We're about to open it up to the rest of the list. Like I said, we've got some funding. So anyone excited about startups and Angular, come talk to me after. Thanks.
One last thing we'll do a little raffle. Put this on so I can log in. So Front-End Masters, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They do some basically like trainings for front-end development, and they've given us a bunch of annual subscriptions to give away at the meetup. These things are like almost $400 a piece, so it's pretty awesome that they gave them to us. So I got the meetup page, and I wrote a little script for the console that's going to randomly select one of the RSVPs. So I hope you RSVP'd. Aaron Peterson. All right, you win. Congratulations. Come see me afterwards. And then I also have a JavaScript book. I left it over on the table, but I think it's something about HTML5. I can't remember. What does it say? HTML5 cookbook from O'Reilly for Dave Watson. All right, Dave, it's yours. Cool. Thanks again for everyone coming out. There's going to be a little bit of a change next month. We will not be in this building. Task is actually moving. We're in the same plaza, like the same building park, but like just the new building that they're building up here. So next month, don't come here, go there. We'll update it on the meetup so you know where to go. But just know that there's going to be a change. And then also being the 1-year anniversary, we got cake. So yeah, we got a bunch out here in the hallway, but Matt's gonna come out. He's our